They left him to die in the desert until the sons of the woman he destroyed pulled him from the sand and made him live with what he'd done. No one expected Calvin Moore to vanish, not like this. Once the ruthless titan of urban development, he had built empires from glass and concrete, bulldozing lives beneath balance sheets and boardroom decisions. But in the end, it wasn't an enemy or protester who took him down. It was his own people. Dumped in the Mojave Desert with no phone, no water, and no witnesses, Calvin was left to die under the unforgiving sun. What they hadn't counted on was the desert remembering. 3 boys, barefoot, silent, and watchful, pulled him from the dust and carried him not to a hospital or police station, but to a place that did not exist on any map Winter's Crossing. Here, among makeshift homes and resilient souls, Calvin woke not to vengeance, but to obscurity. The boys did not ask who he was. They did not need to. In their quiet eyes was the memory of a woman he had forgotten, Lena Grace, displaced and erased by his ambition. What began as survival would become reckoning. What started in silence would reshape everything he thought he knew about power, legacy, and what it means to stay. This is not a story about redemption. It's a story about choosing not to leave. They had planned it for months, quietly, methodically, like any of the hostile takeovers Calvin Moore had once orchestrated himself. Only this time, he wasn't the one pulling the strings. Calvin had always believed control was a matter of leverage. Own the land, the contract, the silence. And for most of his life, that belief had served him well. He had built towers that swallowed the skyline, raised neighborhoods with signatures, and held entire city councils in his pocket. But on the morning he boarded the company jet for what he thought was a retreat with select board members, something was already wrong. The smiles were too fixed, the air too still. He'd built his empire on silence. But this was a different kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your ribs and warns you you're no longer the one holding the knife. The plane never landed in Palm Springs. No emails, no itinerary. Just a long, hot descent into nowhere. When the engines shut off, Calvin stepped out to a sun that sliced across his skin like broken glass. The pilot didn't meet his eyes. Neither did the 3 board members who'd accompanied him. They stood still as statues until one of them handed him a half-empty bottle of water and said, "This is as far as you go." At first, he thought it was a joke, some twisted power play, a test of loyalty or dominance. Calvin had played those games. He had invented some of them. But as the jet engines roared back to life and the door sealed shut, reality struck. The desert was real. The heat was real, and no one was coming back. He ran, of course, or tried to. But the sand is not made for men like Calvin, men who wear tailored shoes and believe they're invincible. He stumbled, fell, crawled. The sun overhead pulsed like a threat, relentless and personal. Every breath came harder than the last, his throat raw, his skin burning, time lost shape, hours, maybe days, blurred into hallucination. He saw Lena's face once, or thought he did, her eyes filled with smoke and silence, like the day the bulldozers came. He remembered the sound of her boy crying, remembered telling his assistant to deal with it, remembered not remembering her name until just now. His body gave out near a cluster of rocks that offered no shade. He thought he would die there. He was ready to. And for a man who had spent his life commanding boardrooms and dismissing human stories as liabilities, death seemed like a fitting end. He had no one left who would care. No family. No legacy that wasn't bought. Just assets, properties. A name etched in metal on glass towers. But metal doesn't mean anything to the desert. The desert strips away names. It leaves bones. That was what he expected to vanish, be swallowed by dust and wind, a cautionary tale no one would hear. But death didn't come. Instead, there was a shadow, then another, 3 of them. At first, he thought they were wolves, then ghosts, then hallucinations. But when one of them knelt beside him and placed a wet cloth, real water, impossibly cool against his lips, he began to sob, not for help, not even from pain, but because someone had touched him, because in all his years of conquest and control, no one had touched him without wanting something in return. These boys didn't ask questions. They didn't demand his name. They simply lifted him, slowly, gently, onto a wooden cart with bike wheels that squeaked in protest. Calvin drifted in and out of consciousness as they pulled him across dry land, through wind and silence and distance that stretched beyond reason. He saw makeshift homes, fences made from scrap metal and wood, gardens growing out of bathtubs, children laughing in a language he'd forgotten, and finally, a sign etched in chalk on a broken door, Winter's Crossing. He was brought inside, given water, given shade, no police, no hospital. No one asked what he had done to end up in the desert, and Calvin, for the first time in his life, had no words. He only had breath and guilt and silence. Somewhere outside, a wind chime made of rusted spoons clinked in the breeze. It sounded like judgment. He should have died there alone, nameless. Another cautionary shadow swallowed by the desert. His lips had cracked open, his skin blistered and curled, and his thoughts drifted like the sand beneath him, unanchored, directionless. He no longer knew if it was morning or night, nor did he care. Pain had faded to numbness, and his body had begun to forget it once belonged to a man of power. Then came the sound. Not wind, not vultures, he'd heard those, but something else soft, careful footsteps, and the faint rattling of a wooden wheel. His swollen eyelids barely opened, but the shapes came into focus, 3 boys, barefoot, lean, and sun-darkened, silhouettes against the burning horizon. They moved without fear or hesitation, as if they had done this before, as if dragging dying men from the brink of death was routine. One of them, the tallest, bent down and pressed the back of his hand to Calvin's forehead, then said something in a language Calvin didn't catch. The others nodded. There was no urgency in their movements, but there was precision, like a ritual, like something sacred. They lifted him together, slowly, with surprising strength, his limbs limp, head lolling like a sack of sand. The smallest boy held his wrist for a moment, as if checking for life, then gave a slight nod. They secured him on a wooden cart hitched to a rusted bicycle, 2 wheels tied together with leather straps and rope. It groaned under his weight, but it held. Calvin didn't speak. He couldn't. His mouth was parched beyond sound, his thoughts too scattered to form even a word. But his eyes, half-lidded and burned from the sun, remained open just long enough to see them walk. They took turns pedaling, pushing, guiding. The road, if it could be called that, was barely a path, jagged, winding through sagebrush and cracked earth. It seemed to stretch into nowhere, but the boys followed it like they knew where it would end, and maybe they did. Calvin faded in and out, catching glimpses between blinks, a lizard darting under a rock, a raven circling overhead, the creak of the cart over dried mud. He thought he heard a humming sound, soft, childlike. Maybe one of them was singing, or maybe it was the wind. Somewhere in the depths of that delirium, he remembered being 6 years old, hiding in a closet while his parents screamed at each other over money. He remembered holding his breath, willing himself invisible. That same breath now shuddered in his chest, rasping like a broken fan blade. He must have blacked out, because when he opened his eyes again, the sun had shifted and they had arrived. It wasn't a town. Not really. It was more like the bones of one built from what the world had thrown away. Tin walls, plywood fences, roofs made from traffic signs and tarp. But there was a rhythm to it, a kind of order in the chaos. Gardens grew out of tires. Laundry hung in perfect lines between weathered beams. Children ran barefoot through alleyways of dust, their laughter crisp against the wind. There were murals too painted on the sides of old shipping containers. Faces, flowers, fists, flames. Words Calvin didn't understand in languages he'd never needed to learn. The cart creaked to a stop in front of a long, low structure made from reclaimed pallets and painted in deep, earthy reds. A metal wind chime clinked softly overhead. One of the boys ducked inside, emerging moments later with a woman wearing a tool belt and a linen scarf over her head. She looked at Calvin for a long time, not with fear or suspicion, but with something stranger recognition. Not of who he was, but of what he was. A man broken. The boys lifted him again, this time more gently, and carried him inside. The air was cooler there, shaded and thick with the scent of rosemary and smoke. He was laid onto a cot covered in mismatched fabric, and someone brought a bowl of water. Another touched his arm with a cloth soaked in something that stung alcohol. Maybe. Still. No one asked his name. No one demanded an explanation. The boy's silence since the beginning disappeared without fanfare. He wanted to call after them, to say something, anything, but his throat was sandpaper. The woman whispered to someone outside. Supplies were brought in. A fan turned on. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang 3 times. Then the door shut gently, and he was alone. But not entirely. Through the cracked window, he could see the boys again, walking away with purpose, and for the first time in a long, long time, Calvin Moore, real estate king, corporate executioner, man who never needed saving, felt something he couldn't name. Not gratitude, not relief, something deeper, something like being seen. And somewhere, on the wall beside him, a fading hand-painted sign spelled it out in crooked white letters, Winter's Crossing. The room smelled of smoke, earth, and something faintly herbal, maybe sage, or dried mint crushed into a poultice. Calvin lay flat on a thin mattress that crinkled with every breath, his body aching in places he hadn't known could ache. The walls around him were made of uneven plywood patched with strips of tin and canvas, and the ceiling sagged just slightly where the beams didn't quite meet. A curtain, not a door, fluttered in the entryway every time someone passed by. There was no air conditioning, no sterile white walls, no beeping machines or professional hands clad in latex gloves. This wasn't a hospital. It wasn't even a clinic. It was a space bear, quiet and fragile in the way that made everything inside it feel precious. His lips were cracked, but no longer bleeding. Someone had smeared balm across them, thick and slightly bitter. His skin, burned and blistered, had been wrapped in long strips of cloth that smelled like ash and eucalyptus. A bucket of water sat by the bed, not cold, but clean. Next to it was a towel folded with surprising care. Whoever had cleaned him hadn't rushed. They had washed the sand from his scalp, the blood from his knees, the shame from his face. A plastic fan buzzed in the corner, cutting the heat just enough to keep him breathing. The only light came from a lantern hung on a nail, its flame flickering as if uncertain whether it should stay. Every now and then, A shadow would pause in the doorway, a child, a hand holding a bowl, someone whispering to someone else, and then disappear. No names, no questions, just motion, gentle, purposeful motion. Once, when he opened his eyes more fully, he saw the smallest of the three boys sitting cross-legged at the far end of the room, carving something into a piece of driftwood with the edge of a broken spoon. He didn't look up, didn't speak, just carved. Calvin tried to raise himself, but the pain pulled him flat again. His throat ached for water, but even more for words. Any word, but none came. He didn't know how to speak here. This place wasn't built for language. It was built for survival. And in survival, words were luxuries. That afternoon, or maybe it was morning, he had no idea the eldest boy came in with a bowl of something warm. It smelled like corn and roots, thick and earthy. He didn't offer it with a smile or a word. He simply sat beside the bed and lifted a spoon to Calvin's lips. It wasn't pity in his eyes. It wasn't kindness either. It was something else. A responsibility born not of charity, but of code. You find someone in the desert. You don't leave them to die. That was the rule here. After a few mouthfuls, the boy set the bowl down, wiped Calvin's chin with a torn cloth, and left. Calvin wanted to say thank you, but the words still wouldn't form. He lay back and stared at the patchwork ceiling, wondering how long this place had existed and how many others had come through these walls. He thought about the kind of man he used to be, the one who would have rolled his eyes at a place like this, called it a squat, a slum, an eyesore to be cleared for development. He had signed away entire neighborhoods without looking twice. Maybe this had once been one of them. Maybe Lena had lived not far from here, before the bulldozers came. The fan clicked once, then resumed its hum. Dust settled on the windowsill, and as the light dimmed into the orange hue of dusk, Calvin Moore, billionaire builder of steel and glass, lay wrapped in salvaged linens, fed by the hands of children, and watched over by silence. They didn't speak much. Not to him, and not even to each other in his presence. The three boys moved like a single rhythm, woven into the fabric of the place, their steps light, their tasks intuitive, as if they had lived through this routine many times before. They never introduced themselves. Not once did they offer names, nor did they ask for his. To them, he was not Calvin Moore, billionaire, mogul, or ghost of destruction. He was simply the man they had pulled from the sand. A burden, perhaps, a stranger, but not an enemy. They treated him like someone to be kept alive, nothing more and nothing less. The eldest seemed to lead without speaking, his eyes steady and unreadable, his hands calloused and precise. He tended to Calvin's burns with practiced ease, wrapping bandages made of torn linens dipped in a cool herbal solution that stung but worked. When he wasn't attending to Calvin, he was reinforcing the edges of the structure they called home, checking the beams, patching the gaps, tending a small patch of green where cornstalks rose defiantly against the drought-hardened soil. The middle boy, quieter still, always barefoot and never far from a chipped metal pot, seemed to manage their food and fire. He boiled water with clockwork regularity, portioned rice with the economy of someone who had learned early what hunger meant. He never looked Calvin directly in the eye. But once, when pouring him a cup of warm broth, their hands touched. The boy didn't flinch. He simply turned away, and Calvin noticed then the burn scar along his forearm, a ribbon of pain long healed but never forgotten. The youngest, no older than 10, was the only one who ever lingered near Calvin's cot after the tasks were done. He carved things, wooden animals, figures, patterns into driftwood and scrap. Calvin once woke to find a small carving of a coyote on the crate beside him, its shape imperfect but unmistakable. There was no note, no gesture to claim credit, just the silent offering of something made by hand. The boy sometimes hummed when he thought no one could hear, and once, Calvin caught a snatch of melody that sounded like something old, something learned by ear rather than taught. None of them ever asked what happened to him in the desert. They didn't seem to care why he had been left to die, nor what he had done before. Perhaps they already knew. Perhaps it didn't matter. In Winter's Crossing, survival was not earned by who you had been, but by what you were willing to do now. And these boys, nameless, fatherless, quietly defiant, had already done more for him than anyone in his life had ever done without a contract. They had given him water when he was nothing but dust. They had shared space when he had no roof. They had treated his pain without demanding his past. Their silence was not cold. It was ancient, deliberate, protective. Calvin sensed that names here carried weight, and to give one was not a courtesy but a decision. They weren't hiding. They were waiting for what? He didn't know. But in the way they glanced at one another, in the way the eldest occasionally watched him when he thought Calvin was asleep, there was something unspoken holding them together, a pact, a grief, a memory. He wondered if they had known someone like him before, someone who came in power and left ruin, and yet they did not punish him. They did not test him. They simply allowed him to be. Every gesture was quiet, deliberate. A spoon placed, a cloth changed, a door left slightly ajar for air to move freely. There was no kindness in the conventional sense, no comfort meant to reassure him. And yet, in their silence, Calvin found a kind of presence he had never known. No performance, no negotiations, just three boys, orbiting one another like stars around an unseen center, slowly stitching a stranger back to life without ever telling him why. In the hazy space between sleep and fever, where time unraveled and memories bled into dreams, Calvin drifted. The room around him blurred into fragments, flickers of lamplight, whispers of movement, the distant clink of a spoon against metal, but none of it anchored him. He floated through his own mind like a man lost at sea, and somewhere in the currents of his delirium, a name kept surfacing: Lena Grace. It began as a whisper, barely audible, trailing at the edge of consciousness like a wind through tall grass. At first, he thought it was someone else's memory, a voice from outside the room, something the boys had murmured while they cared for him. But it returned again, louder each time, threaded through the rhythm of his breath, pulsing between heartbeats. Lena Grace. Her name wasn't unfamiliar, it wasn't fresh, but it carried a weight that turned his stomach in its fevered state. The sound of it dragged him backward through years of concrete and signatures and condemned buildings, through protests he had ignored and eviction notices he'd never read. Lena, Grace, a woman. He remembered, from a file, a tenant, a problem case. They had called her. She had refused to leave when the redevelopment order came through. She had stood on her porch while the backhoes lined up outside her fence, a child clinging to her leg, and another standing barefoot on the steps. He had never spoken to her directly. That was what lawyers were for. But he'd seen the photo in the report, the look in her eyes, fierce and weary, the kind that spoke of 1,000 generational cuts and the refusal to bleed. He had signed the order to demolish the housing block that contained her unit without a second glance. He remembered now. The project had been called Horizon East, 28 acres of former public housing rezoned and earmarked for luxury retail and high-rise condos. The report had listed L, Grace as one of the last holdouts, a potential PR concern. His assistant had flagged it, said something about optics, about media exposure if children were caught on video. But Calvin had waved it off. "It's not personal," he had said. "It's policy." In the fever, those words now echoed like curses. He saw her face again, not in a photograph this time, but vividly sweat glistening on her brow, hair coiled tight at her neck, eyes boring into the camera as if daring the world to look away. He heard her voice, not pleading, but resolute, saying, "We built these walls. We raised our children here, and you're not taking that from us." The image shifted, warped by heat and memory. The porch vanished. Smoke rose. Sirens howled, but no one came. Children cried. Dust choked the air. In the dream, he tried to stop it, tried to scream, but no sound came. His limbs were heavy, his mouth filled with ash. Lena stood in the center of it all, unmoving, her gaze fixed on him as if she knew he was watching. And then, softly, she said his name not with rage, not with sadness, but with something worse: disappointment. That cut deeper than all the accusations he had ignored over the years. Her name clung to him like sweat, seeped into the bandages, wound around his spine. Lena Grace. Who had she been before the eviction? Who was she to these boys? Was she the mother, the sister, the teacher? Was she still alive? Or had she become another casualty buried in a statistic? He didn't know, but he feared the answer. Every time he closed his eyes, she was there again, and the sound of her name felt less like a memory and more like an indictment. He began to murmur it in his sleep, unaware that the boys sometimes paused outside the curtain to listen. One night, the youngest lingered longer than the others, his small frame backlit by moonlight, and Calvin, half conscious, reached out and whispered it again. "Lena. Lena Grace." The boy didn't answer. He didn't move. He only stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something Calvin had not yet said. And then, just as quietly as he had come, the boy slipped away into the dark. The memories did not return all at once. They came in fragments out of order, fogged by time but sharpened now by something he hadn't felt in years: regret. As Calvin lay beneath the patched roof of a place built by hands far humbler than his own, his mind began to pull him backward, as if it could no longer bear the weight of pretending. There had been so many projects, so many parcels of land transformed into concrete visions of progress, that the faces had blurred into numbers. But certain ones, now, would not blur. They burned. It had started decades ago with a single strategy: identify low-value neighborhoods, rezone them for development, purchase them cheap, and convert them into profit. Urban renewal, they called it, a prettier name for displacement. He had signed hundreds of contracts, spoken on stages about innovation and urban transformation, shook the hands of mayors and governors who praised him for revitalizing dead spaces. But those dead spaces had always been alive with people, families, histories, voices, cultures he had never taken the time to understand. He had called them liabilities, holdouts, barriers to progress. He remembered one deal in particular, Horizon East, not because it was the largest, but because it was the most resistant. The land was perfect, a cluster of aging buildings just beyond the city's growing skyline, home to over 400 residents, most of them black, immigrant, or elderly. The market forecast predicted millions in profit if it could be turned quickly. His legal team had warned him it might get messy. Community organizers had already begun stirring protests, and the local press had latched onto a few human interest stories. But Calvin had dismissed it all. Offer them relocation packages, bus vouchers, temporary housing assistance. Whatever gets them out. Just don't delay the permits. And so it began. Letters were sent. Notices posted. Utility services were cut off. Slowly, the people left. Some willingly, most out of fear or exhaustion, but not all. A handful resisted, and among them was a woman named Lena Grace. He hadn't met her. He never met any of them. But her name had appeared in enough reports to catch his eye. She was loud, they said, not in volume, but in presence. A mother of 3, active in the tenants' council, a nurse at the nearby clinic. She had spoken at city meetings, demanding accountability. She had written to the mayor, filed injunctions, led marches. She's trying to turn this into a media circus, one of his lawyers said. Calvin had barely looked up from his steak, then shut it down. One photo remained etched in his mind. Lena standing on her porch, arms crossed, children behind her, chin high against the machinery parked just feet from her front step. The bulldozers had been scheduled for 7 her way. Sharp. She had still been in the house when they arrived. The crew had paused, unsure. But the order had already come down. "Proceed," Calvin had said, no delays. He remembered the video. It had gone viral for a few days, a blurry phone recording of Lena carrying her youngest out of the front door, barefoot as the porch began to shake. People had marched. Hashtags trended. But it passed. It always passed. After the dust settled, the project moved forward. Concrete was poured. Glass walls went up. Horizon East became the Valencia district, a gleaming, open-concept urban luxury development with dog spas, rooftop bars, and imported stone countertops. Units sold out in 3 months. Calvin made $34 million in profit. And Lena Grace. He never asked, never looked, never cared. But now, lying under the slanted beams of Winter's Crossing, her name echoed louder than profit margins. His fingers, once curled around pens that erased lives, now trembled with something he couldn't define. He remembered the other faces, too. An old man who had tried to chain himself to a lamppost. A young mother who screamed until her voice cracked. Children who watched their homes crumble, unsure where their toys would sleep that night. And always, the same cold justification. It's not personal. It's business. But that was the lie, wasn't it? That it was ever just business. The people he had displaced didn't get to retreat into corner offices or penthouses. They didn't have the luxury of detachment. Their lives were cracked open, and he had walked away. Until now. He wondered how many of those families had scattered, how many children had grown up with the memory of sirens and shaking floors, how many names he had buried beneath blueprints. And he feared that the 3 boys who had pulled him from the desert might have been among them, or worse, the sons of the woman he had personally erased. His chest tightened with the thought. What if this place, this Winter's Crossing, was not a coincidence, but a mirror? What if the boys knew exactly who he was, and still chose not to speak it aloud? What if silence was their vengeance? In the world he came from, silence was bought. In this place, it felt earned, and in that silence, Calvin Moore, urban architect, titan of reinvention, began, for the first time in his life, to reckon not with his empire, but with the ruins it had left behind. It came to him slowly, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, creeping ache in the chest, the kind of knowing that doesn't announce itself with lightning, but arrives like a bruise you didn't notice until someone pressed too hard. He had been watching the boys for days now, his strength barely returning, his mind sharpening even as his body remained frail. They moved through the settlement with ease and certainty, not guests here, but guardians, fixtures of this invisible world. The eldest moved like a shadow, his eyes too steady for someone his age, always watching, always measuring. The middle one, quieter still, kept the fire lit, the water clean, the space around them protected. And the youngest, barely more than a child, with the same sharp cheekbones, the same intense silence. Calvin knew those cheekbones. He had seen them before, not on the boys, on someone else. Someone standing on a crumbling porch with her chin raised and the wind in her eyes. Lena Grace. He couldn't breathe the moment it clicked. The air left his lungs as if the room had suddenly been sealed shut. He looked at the boys not as saviors now, but as mirrors, each one bearing some echo of the woman he had erased. The eldest had her eyes defiant, steady, quiet with fury. The middle boy had her posture, her silence the kind that screamed. And the youngest, small and watchful, had her face. Not exactly, but in pieces, in movement. In the way his mouth twitched when thinking too hard, or the way his hands remained busy even when still. Calvin didn't need DNA. He didn't need confirmation. The truth was in the shape of their grief, the rhythm of their steps, the way they had looked at him from the moment they found him, without fear, without hate, but with something colder. Knowledge. They knew who he was. They had known the moment they saw him, half dead and burning under the desert sun. They had recognized the man who signed the papers, who ordered the bulldozers, who crushed their mother's home and called it progress. And they had still carried him, fed him, healed him, not out of mercy, not out of forgiveness, but out of something deeper and more devastating, the decision to make him see. Not to kill him, not to punish him, but to force him to live among the people he had tried to forget, to make him remember every name he had erased, starting with the one that now echoed in every gesture they made. Lena Grace. He began to hear it in everything, the way the eldest boy placed a cloth over his forehead, as if laying a stone on a grave, the way the middle one stirred the soup, the same direction, every night, like a ritual. The way the youngest carved wooden figures, each one left beside his cot like tiny sentinels, watching, waiting. They weren't doing this to save him. They were doing it to make him see, to make him sit inside the shell of what he had broken and feel it, minute by minute. Calvin had spent his whole life turning people into abstractions, names on ledgers, units in spreadsheets. He had learned to calculate suffering and risk assessments. But now, here, he was surrounded by the math he had never bothered to do. 3 boys, 1 woman, a house, a life. Gone. He remembered the file again. Lena Grace had refused all offers. She had written letters, he had never read them. She had attended hearings, he had skipped them. She had carried her children out of a collapsing home, and he had been drinking wine on a rooftop bar the same night. The board had congratulated him on his resolve. The press had moved on in a week, and yet, here they were, her sons, not ruined, not broken, but strong, silent, watchful. And he, the man who had once owned towers and cities, now lay powerless in a shack held up by salvaged beams and human dignity. He wanted to speak, to ask, to confess, but something in their eyes stopped him. This was not a courtroom. There would be no verdict, no absolution. Words would not help him here. This was not a place of forgiveness. It was a place of truth, and truth. Calvin was beginning to understand. was not spoken. It was lived. So he watched them. He studied their movements, trying to remember who they might have been before the wrecking crews came. What had they lost? What had they rebuilt? What had they carried from the ashes of their mother's life into this place where kindness and silence were stronger than revenge? They could have let him die. It would have been easy, poetic, even. No one would have found him. No one would have asked questions. The desert was good at swallowing men like him, but they had done something worse. They had saved him. And in doing so, they had forced him to confront a kind of pain that no wealth could buy his way out of. Calvin closed his eyes and saw her again, not the woman in the photo, but the real Lena, as she might have been before the eviction, laughing in a kitchen, singing to her boys, building a home, not a house. He saw the life he had never bothered to imagine, and now, in the faces of her sons, he saw what she had left behind, not just in blood, but in strength, in defiance, in grace. Lena Grace. Not gone, not forgotten, alive in every breath they took. And for the first time in his life, Calvin Moore wished he could undo everything. But the past does not return. It only haunts. It took time, days, maybe weeks, for Calvin to truly see Winter's Crossing, not just as a backdrop to his own unraveling, but as a living, breathing organism built on something more enduring than wealth interdependence. What had first seemed to him like a scattering of shacks, scrap metal, and salvaged wood slowly revealed itself as a meticulously sustained ecosystem forged not from privilege but from survival and solidarity. It was not chaos, it was choreography. It was not poverty, it was purpose. From his cot beneath the patched roof, Calvin began to observe with the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime overlooking. The people of Winter's Crossing moved like parts of a shared body, every gesture calibrated to nourish the whole. Each morning began before the sun crested the horizon, not with alarms or schedules, but with the soft clang of pans, the hiss of boiling water, and the quiet murmur of voices assigning tasks. There were no titles, no visible hierarchy, but everyone knew what needed doing and who was best at doing it. The boy with the burn scar fixed solar lamps with scraps of copper and stubborn patience. An older woman with braided silver hair repaired sandals with thread she spun from nylon. A teenager roasted cactus over open flame, seasoning it with herbs from a small garden surrounded by rusted bicycle wheels bent into a fence. No one took more than their share. No one asked for permission to help. They simply did. A broken window was patched before dusk. A child's cough drew herbs from a neighbor's pouch before the sun set. If someone cried, they weren't left alone. If someone laughed, they weren't laughed at. It wasn't the kind of system you could draft into a blueprint or scale into a model. It was slower, quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more human. Calvin, once praised for designing entire cities, now realized he had never built anything that could keep people truly alive. His cities ran on electricity, surveillance, and profit margins. Winter's Crossing ran on trust. There was no running water, but there was a ritual around its scarcity that ensured no one went without. Rain barrels were positioned strategically along the slope of makeshift roofs, and their collection was treated like sacred duty. Water was filtered through charcoal and cloth, and every child knew how to ration it. Food was grown in raised beds built from discarded crates, and everyone contributed to their maintenance. If a crop failed, no one was blamed. If a meal was short, no one ate until all had a portion. Even the animal's thin chickens and a three-legged dog seemed to understand they were part of the fragile, precious balance. What stunned Calvin most wasn't just the efficiency, but the joy that punctuated the hardship. There were nights when songs drifted through the dust-heavy air, rising from a bonfire surrounded by clapping hands and tapping feet. The children danced. The elders told stories. Even the three boys, so silent by day, allowed themselves to soften under the cover of night. He saw the youngest lean into his brother's shoulder and laugh so hard his ribs shook. He saw the middle one carve not from grief, but from memory, shaping the face of a woman into a piece of driftwood with reverent care. And he saw the eldest stoic, unreadable smile just once, so briefly it felt like witnessing lightning. Calvin had never known a community like this, not in the suburbs of his childhood where fences meant privacy, not connection, not in the towers he built where neighbors rarely exchanged names, and certainly not in the boardrooms where every deal was a competition, every colleague a threat. In Winter's Crossing, strength didn't come from dominance. It came from continuity, every generation stitching itself to the next, not through wealth, but through wisdom. He watched a young girl teach an old man how to use a solar charger for a radio. He watched that same man tell a story from a war Calvin had only read about in newspapers. He saw lives that, by his old metrics, had no value, no credit score, no address, no assets, yet carried more resilience and grace than any CEO he had ever known. There was a code here, unspoken, but unbreakable. You are not alone. Not when the rain comes. Not when the fever breaks. Not when the past knocks at your door in the form of a dying man with blood on his hands. Even Calvin was included, not accepted, not trusted, but not abandoned either. They fed him because he was hungry. They dressed his wounds because they were open. They let him watch because seeing was part of the punishment and perhaps part of the healing. One afternoon, he witnessed a girl no older than 10 barter a bundle of mint for a spool of wire. No money changed hands, only needs and offerings. Later, she returned to her family with enough material to mend their tarp roof before the monsoon season. He sat beneath a tree and wondered how many roofs he had torn off in his lifetime without ever thinking of what came after the storm. He had spent years believing that survival belonged to the powerful. But here, among those he had once rendered invisible, he saw survival redefined as unity, as presence, as grace. They didn't need him. That was perhaps the most humbling truth. They had built this world not because of his absence, but in spite of it. And now, in the ashes of the empire he had once ruled from afar, he was nothing but a witness to the kind of architecture no blueprint could contain. They had survived. And more than that, they had chosen to keep going not with bitterness, but with rhythm, soil, and song. At first, it was nothing. A gesture so small it felt almost accidental. He shifted a pile of firewood closer to the cooking pit, stacking it with trembling fingers so the barefoot boy wouldn't have to bend as far. No one thanked him. No one commented. But no one stopped him either. The next day, he swept the dirt path leading to the central well. Using a worn broom he found leaning against the wall. And though his back screamed in protest and his palms blistered with unfamiliar labor, he finished the task. Again, no words were spoken. But when he returned to his cot that evening, he noticed a folded piece of cloth had been left near his sleeping mat, clean, rough spun, and clearly meant for work. It wasn't a reward. It was permission. And it was all he needed. From then on, Calvin Moore, who once oversaw billion-dollar developments from glass towers lined with Italian marble, began to rise at dawn and walk barefoot across the uneven paths of Winter's Crossing, looking not for redemption, but for something to do. He didn't explain himself. He didn't announce intentions. He simply began to help. He started with simple tasks, clearing broken glass from the greenhouse frame, hauling buckets of gray water from the filtration barrels, removing rusted nails from planks that could be reused. His movements were slow, clumsy at first, his body unaccustomed to anything more physical than the occasional golf swing or rooftop cocktail toast. But the blisters hardened, the muscles remembered. His back, though stiff and bent, stopped complaining as much. And with each passing day, he became less a patient and more a participant. He never asked for approval. He didn't expect it. The community didn't offer applause. They offered space. Space to show up, to contribute, to prove through action alone that he was willing to carry even a fraction of what they bore. He cleaned latrines. He mended roof panels. He pulled weeds from the community garden, wincing under the sun as he tore roots from cracked soil. The younger children would sometimes stare at him, not with fear, but with curiosity. This man with silver at his temples, hands that didn't know what to do with a spade until they learned by repetition. Once, a girl no older than 7 handed him a wooden-handled hoe and nodded toward the raised bed where spinach grew in defiant green patches. He said nothing, just followed her gesture and got to work. It was in the earth that he found his silence mirrored. The soil didn't care who he had been. It accepted his hands, so long as they worked. He turned compost. He hauled manure. He learned how to layer the dry husks with wet scraps to keep the balance. The woman who ran the garden, tall, dark-skinned, with laugh lines deep enough to suggest she'd survived both war and winter, never asked his name. But one morning she handed him a jar of preserved lemon and said, simply, "It's good for blisters." That was the only acknowledgement he ever received, and it was more than enough. The boys watched him too, from a distance. The eldest sometimes appeared near the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The middle one walked past him one day while Calvin was repairing a hinge on a broken door and left behind a small can of grease, without a word. The youngest carved a small emblem, a tree with its roots showing, and left it beside the path Calvin walked every morning to reach the garden. These weren't signs of forgiveness. They were markers of presence, indicators that he was being seen, measured, maybe not hated anymore, but certainly not forgotten. And Calvin didn't want forgiveness. Not really. What he wanted, though he couldn't name it yet, was to belong to something real, something earned, something that couldn't be bought with money or erased with policy. He wanted his hands to matter, his body to be useful, his presence to be more than an intrusion, and so he stayed quiet. He listened. He studied the way the others moved, how they spoke in shorthand grunts, nods, whistles, and how the children learned by doing, not by instruction. There were no schoolhouses, but there was education everywhere in the way a roof was reinforced before rain, in the way food was stored, in the way people gathered for firewood collection without ever needing to be told. One day, while reinforcing a wall panel with nails he'd scavenged from the old supply shed, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the boy with the burn scar, the middle one, always silent. He handed Calvin a cloth-wrapped bundle of cornbread and moved on without a word. Calvin stood there, nails in one hand, food in the other, too stunned to speak. It wasn't a gesture of camaraderie. It was sustenance, a sign that he was no longer an outsider. Not entirely. He was beginning to be folded into the fabric of Winter's Crossing, not by declaration, but by repetition, by showing up, by lifting what he could, by knowing when to stay silent and when to sweep. He began to sleep more deeply, his body worn not by guilt, but by effort. At night, he would lie beneath the sloped roof of the communal shelter and hear the soft breath of those sleeping beside him, their lungs rising and falling in harmony. For the first time in his life, he was poor in everything he had once prized: power, prestige, control, but rich in something he had never possessed before: presence. He didn't know what tomorrow held. He didn't know if the community would ever truly trust him, but each day he rose, picked up a tool, and worked, not to atone, not to erase, just to help. To carry, even slightly, the weight of what he had once destroyed. And in that quiet effort, in that humble offering, he began to build not a legacy, but a life. One brick, one seed, one gesture at a time. The fire crackled softly in the heart of the camp, sending sparks spiraling into the night as the desert wind whispered around the circle. It was a quiet evening. Like so many before it, children curled against makeshift pillows, elders humming stories under their breath, the occasional pop of sap from firewood breaking the silence. Calvin sat near the edge, where the fire's warmth barely touched his skin, the glow casting long shadows on the dust that clung to his boots. The boys were there too, always at the perimeter, never far but never close eyes reflecting the firelight with the same guarded stillness they had worn since the day they carried him from the desert. He hadn't planned to speak, not that night. But the weight had been growing heavier each day, pressing on his ribs, coiling around his throat. He had begun to see Lena in every flicker of fire, in every face turned toward him in silence. In every morning he woke not to steel and glass, but to dirt beneath his fingers and the quiet breath of lives he once deemed invisible. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "My name is Calvin Moore." The name hung in the air like smoke, and though no one gasped, he saw the flicker in their eyes, recognition not newly formed, but confirmed. He continued, slowly, not to justify, not to defend, but simply to say it aloud. "I was the man behind Horizon East. I gave the order to raise your mother's home. Lena Grace." Even in the stillness of the desert night, her name carried weight. He paused, waiting for something: a cry, an accusation, a stone thrown from the dark, but there was nothing. Just the fire, just the wind, just the sound of his own confession spilling like ash. "I never met her," he said, voice trembling. "Not really. I saw her in a report. I saw her in a photo. A woman refusing to move. I labeled her a liability. I never read her letters. I never heard her voice. But I signed the papers that made her disappear." His hands trembled in his lap, the calluses he had earned over weeks of labor now trembling with guilt no hammer could fix. "I told myself it was just business. I told myself none of it was personal, but it was her life, and your lives. And I took it from you. I took her from you." The boys sat still, stone-like. The youngest lowered his gaze. The middle one clenched a carving in his lap. The eldest met Calvin's eyes without flinching, without blinking. It was not hatred he saw there. It was history, witness. And for Calvin, that was worse, because it meant they had known all along. And still they had saved him. Still they had let him walk among them. Still they had allowed him to earn his place, even as they carried the memory of what he'd done. He looked into the fire, voice cracking. "I don't ask for your forgiveness. I wouldn't even know how to begin to deserve it. But I needed you to hear it from me. I needed you to know that I remember her name, Lena Grace. And I will not forget again." The silence that followed was deep and unbroken. But in that silence, Calvin felt the weight shift, not lifted, but shared, not absolved, but named. And sometimes, naming the wound is the first step toward healing. He didn't ask them for forgiveness. The word itself felt too grand, too loaded, too presumptuous to pass through his mouth. Forgiveness was something holy, something you gave only when the wound had stopped bleeding, and Calvin knew their wound hadn't. Perhaps it never would. He had been the hand that caused it, and no apology, no penance, no labor in the sun could ever rewind time to save their mother, to rebuild what he had helped destroy. So he didn't grovel. He didn't plead. He simply looked at them, at the three boys whose eyes carried the full weight of their mother's absence, and said the only thing he could offer with honesty: "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. I don't expect it. I won't insult you by pretending a few months of work can balance out a lifetime of harm." His voice was steady, not rehearsed, not polished, just raw. "But I am asking this. Let me stay." He let the words sit there, fragile in the quiet. He hadn't realized until they left his mouth how much he meant them. This place, Winter's Crossing, was not comfort. It was not safety in the conventional sense. It had no running water, no locked doors, no security systems. It had no prestige, no contracts, no currency. And yet it was the first place in his entire life where he had felt human, not powerful, not needed, not feared, just human. Here, he had learned to carry things that weren't his, to repair things he hadn't broken, to plant things he might never live to see bloom. And he didn't want to leave. Not because he wanted to escape judgment, but because he wanted to keep learning how to live honestly. "I want to stay," he said again, softer this time, more to himself than anyone else. "I want to keep helping. I want to be of use." He didn't expect a response. In Winter's Crossing, answers didn't come wrapped in speeches or applause. They came in gestures, in space, in silence. And so, after his words faded into the desert night, Calvin simply lowered his head, hands folded, not in prayer, but in surrender. He was not asking to be absolved. He was asking to be allowed to remain among the people he had once exiled from his world, to learn their names, to carry their water, to wake up each day and prove, not with speeches but with sweat, that he could still serve something greater than himself. The fire snapped quietly. A breeze passed through. The children, half asleep, stirred and rolled closer to their elders. The boys said nothing, but the eldest gave a slow nod, barely perceptible, and stood, not in anger, not in finality, just acknowledgement. He walked away, followed by his brothers, into the shelter of the darkness, and Calvin understood. They hadn't said yes, they hadn't said no, but they hadn't turned him away. And that was enough for now. In Winter's Crossing, belonging wasn't granted in words. It was earned in days, in service, in silence. And as Calvin sat beneath the open sky, no longer waiting to be judged, only hoping to be useful, he felt something shift, not redemption, but the right to stay and build whatever came next with his own two hands. They didn't say a word. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even as Calvin crossed paths with them on the narrow trail between the water barrels and the greenhouse, where the boys normally worked in synchronized silence. Their faces remained unreadable, carved in stone, their eyes fixed ahead, their bodies disciplined by years of learning how to survive in a world that took without asking. But Calvin could feel the tension that now threaded through the air between them, thicker than the dust, sharper than the desert wind. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It was fury held in place by restraint so profound. It made their silence louder than any outburst could have. The eldest boy, whose expression had never been soft, now carried a hardness behind his eyes that felt like a wall unbreachable, unforgiving, immovable. He didn't glare. He didn't flinch. He simply looked through Calvin as though the man didn't exist. Not hatred. Worse, indifference forged by pain. The middle one, usually the quiet workhorse of the trio, avoided eye contact altogether. He kept his hands busy scrubbing, hauling, sharpening, but there was an edge to his movements now, a fury simmering just beneath the discipline. When Calvin passed him a spool of twine during garden repairs, the boy took it without acknowledgement, his fingers brushing Calvin's only briefly, like contact with a ghost, and the youngest, who had once left little carvings near Calvin's cot, who had offered him the faintest hints of curiosity, now walked past him as if that fragile bridge had burned entirely. Still, they didn't speak. Still, they didn't leave. They worked the land. They slept in the communal shelter. They did what needed to be done. But where there had once been a cautious, wordless tolerance, there was now a brittle silence that felt like walking barefoot across shards of glass. And yet, they did not tell him to go. They didn't confront him in front of the others. They didn't spit in his face. They didn't shout the name of their mother like a curse to drive him out. Instead, they let him stay. And in that choice made not out of affection, but out of some moral code more ancient than justice, Calvin found himself unraveling. Because silence was not forgiveness. It was a verdict. One that said, we know what you did. We carry her memory in our bones. We do not owe you healing. And we will not pretend this place has room for easy absolution. It was a silence full of anger, but also of control, boys raised in the ashes of a woman's strength, who understood that dignity did not always come with a voice raised in rage. Sometimes, dignity looked like turning your back and doing the work anyway. Sometimes, it meant letting the enemy live long enough to see what he tried to destroy still standing. Calvin bore it, day after day, not out of penance, but out of respect. He didn't try to force conversation. He didn't explain himself again. He didn't beg. He simply kept working, fixing doors, cleaning barrels, preparing soil. His movements slower than theirs, his presence always slightly apart, like a shadow stitched to the edge of their rhythm. He was there, and not quite there. He was tolerated, not trusted. And yet, every morning, he rose with them. Every night, he returned to his corner of the shelter, and the boys, though they never spoke to him, never ordered him out. Their silence was not mercy, but it was also not exile. That was enough. Because in their silence, Calvin saw a truth deeper than anger they had inherited, not just their mother's pain, but also her strength. And strength, they knew, did not always look like vengeance. Sometimes it looked like restraint, like letting the man who broke your world rebuild it, knowing full well he would never live long enough to make it whole again. He did it in silence, not because he feared the backlash he had long since surrendered any need to preserve his name or legacy, but because he understood, at last, that real change didn't arrive with headlines or grand gestures. It was quiet, intentional, personal. And so, while the people of Winter's Crossing tended their gardens, repaired their roofs, and lived their days without ceremony, Calvin Moore sat hunched over a salvaged desk in a corner of the old supply shed, filling out the most important legal documents of his life. With blistered hands and aching joints, he drafted the transfer of titles, the dissolution of dormant holding companies, and the reallocation of assets from trusts once designed to hoard wealth into a legal structure meant to protect something far more valuable than money sovereignty. He had his old legal contacts, those few who hadn't yet disavowed him, quietly notarize and file the necessary paperwork. No press release, no announcement, just envelopes mailed in silence. Digital signatures authenticated beneath the desert moon. Each keystroke a step away from power and a step towards something that, for the first time, felt like justice. He knew Winter's Crossing wasn't on any map. That was the point. It had survived precisely because it had remained invisible to the machinery of greed and development that had swallowed so many others. But invisibility was also its greatest vulnerability. One corporate acquisition, one infrastructure project, one new zoning blueprint, and the entire community could vanish overnight. He knew this intimately. He had been the one drawing those blueprints. He had been the architect of erasure. But now, he was determined to be the architect of preservation. The structure he created wasn't just a donation. It was protection. He reclassified the land as a perpetual use community trust, assigning its stewardship to an intergenerational board composed not of outside benefactors, but of the residents themselves, those who had bled and built and buried and bloomed there. He named the entity the Lena Grace Foundation, a legal fortress designed not just to honor the woman he had destroyed, but to protect the world her sons had grown into despite him. The foundation would own the land outright, tax-exempt and shielded from seizure. It would operate under its own charter, with bylaws written in consultation with the elders of Winter's Crossing, translated into plain language, oral tradition, and communal consensus, rather than corporate jargon. He made sure there were no loopholes, no clauses that could be twisted later by men like he once was. Every lawyer he hired was vetted not by prestige, but by integrity. And each document carried not just his signature, but his resignation from the boards, the trusts, the wealth he once wielded like a weapon. Bit by bit, his empire was dismantled not with fire or scandal, but with legal ink and humility. And when the final transfer was complete, when the deed to the land was no longer in his name but in the collective trust of those who had lived on it with nothing but courage and each other, he sat back and breathed, really breathed for the first time in years. He didn't tell the boys. He didn't tell anyone. He simply walked out of the shed that day and joined them at the well, hauling water like he always did, not as a savior, not as a leader, just as a man finally giving back what never should have been taken. They didn't ask for it. In fact, when Calvin presented the documents, tattered manila folder, handwritten notes, and official seals inked in quiet humility, the boys said nothing at all. The eldest glanced at the signature page, his jaw tight, his eyes unreadable. The middle one took the file and read every line, twice, without a single word of commentary. The youngest just stared at Calvin as if trying to determine whether this was another trick, another man in a long line of powerful figures trying to soothe guilt with control. But it wasn't. Calvin said only this: "It's yours now. The land. The trust. The name. I've stepped away from it all. I don't want a seat. I don't want credit. I just want you to have what should have always been yours." And then he stepped back. It took them days to respond. And when they did, it wasn't through speeches. It was through action. The boys stood in front of the council fire that weekend where the community gathered to share stories, resolve disputes, and trade news, and simply stated, together, the land is protected. We hold it in trust. For all of us. No one clapped. No one wept. But the air shifted, like something ancient had just been righted. The people of Winter's Crossing didn't need ceremonies. They needed stability. And now, for the first time, it had a name, the Lena Grace Foundation, and it had guardians who had bled for it, built it, and would protect it as fiercely as their mother once had. Each boy took on a role, not out of hierarchy, but out of natural rhythm. The eldest, tall and silent, with eyes like storm-worn steel, became the voice at external borders. He met with county officials, navigated permits, negotiated clean water access without ever compromising the soul of the place. He was cautious, guarded but unyielding when it came to the integrity of Winter's Crossing. The middle one, meticulous and quiet, managed resources, solar power, water systems, food storage, rotating crops. He kept records in both notebooks and memory, building a sustainable infrastructure from scratch, often inventing what didn't yet exist. The youngest, though less vocal, became the bridge between generations. He worked with the children, started an informal school, built a library out of old crates, and taught reading, carving, and stories, especially stories about their mother, passed on not as legend, but as lineage. They didn't wear suits. They didn't sit behind desks. They didn't rule. They served, and in doing so, they became not just their mother's legacy, but its future. The community adapted quickly. The transition wasn't disruptive. It was organic. They had always trusted the boys, now that trust was legal, documented, protected. The outside world could come knocking, but Winter's Crossing was no longer defenseless. It had guardians. It had laws. It had names on deeds that could not be erased. Calvin, meanwhile, faded into the background, not out of shame, but out of respect. He still woke early, still hauled water, still fixed hinges. But when the time came for decisions to be made, he stepped aside. The torch had been passed, and for once in his long life, he didn't need to hold it to feel useful. He only needed to stay near the fire, watching the three sons of Lena Grace shape a future that no longer needed saving, only protecting. There was no press release, no breaking news segment, no op-ed in the business section about the disgraced mogul who gave away his fortune and disappeared into the desert. Calvin Moore's final act did not trend, did not echo in headlines, did not ripple across social media, and that was precisely how he wanted it. He didn't need redemption in the eyes of the world. The world had watched him rise and applauded his ruthlessness. It had rewarded his ambition, his cold efficiency, his ability to turn neighborhoods into luxury zones and families into statistics. Let them forget him. Let the world move on. Here, in Winter's Crossing, there were no cameras, no commemorative plaques, no statues erected to immortalize his repentance. There was only work, and that, finally, was enough. Every morning, Calvin woke before the sun, just like everyone else. He folded his blanket, fetched water from the well, and walked the garden rows with bare feet still blistered from the rocky ground. No one treated him as special. No one deferred to him, and he never expected them to. When a door needed fixing, he fixed it. When a child needed watching, he sat with them. When new lumber arrived from the trade routes, he helped unload it, wordless, shoulder to shoulder with those who had once had every reason to exile him. He didn't lecture. He didn't lead. He followed the rhythm of the land, the people, the silence. There were no meetings in his name, no Calvin Moore Day, no commemorative sign declaring his contribution. His name wasn't spoken often at all, and when it was in passing, Cal fixed the hinges, or Cal hauled the crates. That was the version of himself he had chosen to become. not the architect of skylines, but the man who swept their dusty paths, not the author of cityscapes, but the keeper of tools and soil. In a former life, he had owned skyscrapers that bore his name in glass and steel. Here, no one cared what his name used to mean. They only cared if he showed up when needed, if he did his part, if he stayed. Even the children, those too young to know what he had once been, treated him not with awe or caution, but with casual indifference. One little girl had once tugged at his pant leg and asked him to help fix her slingshot. He had done it, fumbling through the repair, and she had given a solemn nod of approval before running off, never asking who he was or why he lived in the corner shelter near the tool shed. That anonymity, that invisibility, was a kind of grace. It let him shed the weight of legacy and simply exist, no longer a man defined by power or money, but by usefulness. And in that quiet repetition in the hauling of water, the turning of compost, the patient sanding of worn door frames, Calvin found something deeper than forgiveness. He found belonging, a belonging that didn't demand transformation overnight, but allowed for it slowly, humbly, through action. He became not a symbol, not a fallen giant, but a man with cracked hands and quiet intentions. In a world that had once crowned him for conquest, he had discovered peace in presence. There was no monument. Just a pair of boots by the door, a clean dish in the drying rack, and the knowledge that tomorrow, when the sun rose again, he would still be here working, quietly, with everyone else. 5 years passed, not with fanfare or sudden transformation, but through quiet, persistent evolution, one harvest, one repaired beam, one educated child at a time. Winter's Crossing, once an anonymous settlement tucked into the forgotten edge of the desert, had become something far more enduring, a blueprint. Not a utopia, but a living, breathing example of what could be built when dignity, resilience, and community were placed at the center of survival. And at the heart of its transformation stood 3 young men whose lives had once been defined by loss, now defined by purpose. Elijah, the eldest, had become an agricultural engineer, not through formal university degrees, though he would earn those in time, but through years of hands-on innovation. He combined traditional desert farming techniques with modern solar aquaponics, building an intricate irrigation system that turned arid soil into thriving green corridors. He taught others not only how to grow food, but how to read the land, how to listen to it, how to create systems that respected its limits rather than exploiting them. He traveled to other settlements across the Southwest, helping them build similar systems, always returning home before the first frost to plant alongside his neighbors, never putting status above sweat. Micah, the quiet, intense middle son, had grown into a community lawyer, trained initially through correspondence courses and mentorship from retired legal aid volunteers who had moved into Winter's Crossing after hearing whispers of its model. He earned his license through grit, discipline, and an unshakable belief that law should protect the vulnerable, not serve the powerful. He now advocated for land rights, citizenship protections, and anti-eviction policies not just for Winter's Crossing, but for similar communities rising across the country. He wore no suits, used no podiums, but his voice measured, calm. Unflinching was often the final word in county meetings and courtrooms where policies once written to displace were being rewritten to defend. Josiah, the youngest, had once carved silent stories into driftwood. Now, he listened to others' stories for a living as a trauma-informed psychologist serving children and families from marginalized communities. After training through a program built in partnership with the Lena Grace Foundation and several state universities, he returned to Winter's Crossing not as a boy with silent rage, but as a man who understood the weight of unspoken grief and the power of presence. He created a counseling center without walls, Sessions often took place under shade trees, beside garden beds, in the rhythm of chores rather than in sterile offices. He helped children name their fears, helped parents forgive themselves, and taught a new generation that healing wasn't a destination, but a continuous act of staying. By now, Winter's Crossing had expanded not outward, but inward. It remained modest in size, its boundaries respected, its values intact. But its blueprint had traveled far. There were now 12 sister communities across the nation, some in deserts, some in forests, some tucked into post-industrial outskirts of forgotten towns. Each one rooted in the principles of self-governance, shared stewardship, and resilience. They were called crossing communities, and each bore a different name, but their spirit was the same. No developers owned them. No corporations ran them. No politicians spoke for them. They were shaped by the people who lived in them, many displaced, many forgotten, now thriving, not by charity, but by structural justice. And in every one of these communities, there was a plaque, hand-carved and humble, not bearing Calvin Moore's name, but Lena Grace's. It read simply, "Here, we stay." Calvin was still there, not as a founder, not as a leader, not as a figurehead for what Winter's Crossing had become. He held no title. He signed no proclamations. His name appeared on no directories, no meeting minutes, no public acknowledgments. He was simply Calvin, an aging man with sun-beaten skin, calloused hands, and a quiet presence that had become as much a part of the landscape as the wind that carved the dunes outside the boundary fence. For 5 years, he had shown up every day, without fail. He repaired broken fencing. He replaced worn-out water filters. He sorted tools, dug compost pits, walked children to the communal schoolhouse when their parents needed a few extra hours in the fields. He didn't ask. He didn't instruct. He simply noticed what needed to be done and did it. People had grown used to him in the way one grows used to a sturdy bench or a well-worn path, something reliable, unobtrusive, there when needed, but never demanding attention. The newcomers' families arriving from cities devastated by eviction, refugees from failed zoning projects, elders who had outlived their pensions often assumed he was a retired maintenance worker or one of the original builders. Few ever guessed that he had once sat atop a billion-dollar real estate empire. Fewer still knew he had once signed the papers that destroyed entire neighborhoods, including the one this community had risen from. But that was by design. Calvin never spoke of his past unless directly asked, and even then, his answers were spare, factual, devoid of drama. He didn't romanticize his fall. He didn't seek pity or praise. He believed the story that mattered wasn't the one about what he had lost, but about what they had built. Sometimes he'd sit quietly near the edge of the gardens, watching Elijah calibrate the water flow system with a group of apprentices, or observe Micah leading a community rights workshop under the canvas shade structure, or catch glimpses of Josiah comforting a crying boy beside the wildflower beds where therapy sessions were often held. He never interrupted. He never tried to insert himself. And yet, there was something in his gaze, soft, steady, humbled, that made clear he was not merely watching them grow, but finding in their growth a quiet form of atonement. In private, when no one was looking, he would run his fingers over the names carved into the community's ledger wall, especially one. At the top, Lena Grace. He would pause there, always, just for a moment, as if anchoring himself to the reason he stayed. He lived simply, in a small structure he had repaired himself, bare wood, tin roof, a small cot, and shelves lined with tools, seed packets, and hand-scrawled notes about maintenance routines. He ate what others ate, He stood in line like everyone else. He never accepted special treatment, and in time, no one offered any. That, too, was a kind of healing not to be elevated, not to be excused, but to be absorbed into the rhythm of a place that had no need for heroes, only people willing to stay and contribute. Calvin didn't leave Winter's Crossing because it was the only place that would take him. He stayed because it was the only place where he had learned what it meant to belong. And in the quiet, anonymous life he now led free of grandeur, free of ambition. Grounded in sweat and service, he had found something that had eluded him his entire life peace. Not from being seen, but from no longer needing to be. When people spoke of Calvin Moore in Winter's Crossing, when they spoke of him at all, it wasn't with reverence, nor resentment. It was with a kind of gentle clarity, the way one might speak of an old tree at the edge of a field that had weathered every season without complaint. No one romanticized his past. The children who had grown up seeing him clean tools and fix steps knew nothing of the towers that once bore his name. The elders who had watched him haul water in silence never asked for stories about his rise or his fall. And the boys, Elijah, Micah, and Josiah, who had once saved him from the brink of death and later carried the community forward on their shoulders, did not glorify or condemn him. They simply let him remain. That, in the end, was the greatest mercy he had ever received, not forgiveness wrapped in words, not a ritual of absolution, but the simple act of being allowed to stay. He earned no statue, no quote etched in stone. His name did not appear on the Foundation's official charter, nor on any of the plaques that marked the sister communities. But when something broke and was quietly fixed overnight, when a child scraped their knee and found a clean cloth and a steady hand waiting without fanfare, when a stranger arrived lost and was wordlessly shown where to find shelter, people knew it was Calvin. And when he was gone, when the day finally came that he did not rise with the sun, did not appear by the well or at the compost pile or at his usual spot beneath the cottonwood tree, there was no city-wide mourning, no broadcast, just a slow, solemn gathering around the garden where he had once rebuilt a broken fence with splinters in his hands and quiet in his mouth. People left small offerings, a rusted wrench, a folded seed packet, a wooden slingshot mended long ago. Elijah spoke only once, and quietly, he stayed. That was all. That was everything. Years later, when newcomers asked who Calvin was after hearing the name whispered at the edge of a task, or seeing a careful mark in a maintenance log, their guides would sometimes pause and point to the old tool shed, now covered in ivy, still standing, always unlocked. He was a man who used to live here, they would say. He helped keep things running. There was no need to say more. His story had become part of the walls, part of the soil. And it was not a story about erasure or redemption. It was a story about presence. He had been there when it mattered. He had not asked for love. He had not run from guilt. He had not demanded anything in return for what he gave. In a world so full of people desperate to be remembered for greatness, Calvin Moore was remembered for something rarer, something quieter, something earned not through apology, but through constancy. He was remembered not because he was forgiven. He was remembered because he didn't leave. In the end, Calvin Moore's story reminds us of something we often forget in a world obsessed with noise, fame, and instant absolution, that presence is more powerful than apology, and staying can speak louder than any speech. We live in a time where many people seek redemption through grand gestures or viral moments, but real healing, true change comes quietly. It comes from showing up every day, from doing the work that no one thanks you for, from accepting that you may never be forgiven, but choosing to stay anyway. Calvin wasn't remembered because he erased the harm he caused. He couldn't. He was remembered because he never ran from it again. In life, We will all make mistakes, some small, some devastating. And when that happens, we face a choice: hide, excuse, vanish, or show up. Maybe the people we hurt will never say, "It's okay." Maybe we don't deserve that, but that doesn't mean we have no path forward. Sometimes, the most honest thing we can offer isn't an apology. It's our hands, our time, our presence, staying, serving, and asking for nothing in return. So here's the truth. You don't need to be a hero. You don't need to fix everything, but you do need to stay. Stay with the people you've hurt. Stay in the spaces you once tried to escape. Stay long enough to be changed by the work of rebuilding. Not just your life, but theirs too. Because the people who remember you in the end won't remember your words. They'll remember whether or not you stayed. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or helped you see redemption in a new light, drop a comment below. Tell us what part hit you hardest. Save this video to come back to when you need to remember what real change looks like. And if you want more stories that speak to the quiet power of presence, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because the ones who stay deserve to be heard.